Art history, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Okay, so with this one, we're going to basically start where we left off last time. And here we have two examples of that dominant form of painting really throughout the 19th century. And that is the French academic tradition. And we're going to see how things basically kind of develop and how different art here towards the latter years of the 1800s here, how it changes pretty radically. Alright, so in this tradition here, part of the whole thing here is choosing some kind of classical type of subject matter, painting things very, very naturalistically, making sure your proportion, your perspective, all of those things are down. Make sure you're hiding your brush strokes to where things are looking as naturalistic as possible. Now, this artist here, Edward Manet, that's with an A, Manet, he's going to be kind of the seminal figure for things that are going to follow. On the left, we see Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and on the right, we see Olympia. And what you're looking at here are two of the most controversial paintings in the history of art. Now, for our eyes, they might not be that different than these paintings. Certainly it's hard for us to see maybe why they would be so controversial. So we're going to look at, kind of why that is. On the left, we see the painting here with these two gentlemen and these two women as well. And one thing that was considered really controversial here is that if we look at other examples of nudes that we've seen, like for instance this one here on the left, this is Bathsheba, so she's kind of this exotic classical subject matter. And so, one validation for working in nude, in that nude style, would be using a classical example, since that's the form that the classical art took. Another example of something you could use as far as nudity here is the fact that she's about to take her bath. And so there's at least some type of validation there. With the woman on the left here, there doesn't seem to be any rational reason why she would have her clothes off and these two men would have their clothes on. So she's not seen as being nude and noble and kind of pure in the artistic sense, as the tradition of art would dictate. She's seen as being naked, and that's seen as being profane. That's seen as being very kind of crass by society's standards. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that she's not this idealistic type of nude the way that she's shown. We see a lot of idealism with this era of art, and she doesn't really fit that mold there. And so that would be another thing that they would have an objection against. It would be one reason why she would stick out again as being naked instead of nude. Another thing is that the way that it's painted was seen very, very inadequate, I guess. If you're used to paintings like this with almost kind of like this perfect finish to it, this painting is very messy by those standards. That you can see the woman bathing in the back. It's hard to tell if she's even bathing because we can't really even see the water. It's hardly painted in. There's parts of the canvas that are really just the underpainting showing through. And so that would be considered kind of the artist really not doing his job fully. It would basically, the normal viewer would look at it and say, oh, well, this guy doesn't know how to paint because he's not doing things right. And that's kind of the interesting thing as far as kind of art historical basis, because Manet would have known the rules. If we look at the painting on the left, he's actually using these figures in the same position based on a Raphael drawing. And so you can't really get any more of a classical example than that. And so he would know the rules to things, and it seems like he's intentionally not obeying the rules. Another thing that was considered inappropriate about the painting on the left is that if you were to show someone nude, like I said, a lot of times you would use this classical example, but here these gentlemen are shown using the dress of the day. So those were contemporary examples, contemporary gentlemen, and they're sewn as such. And so for the woman to be nude, it really doesn't make any sense with that. Okay, so that would be another reason there. Now, if we look at the painting on the right, part of the controversial things that we see with the painting on the right is, again, he would use this traditional type of subject matter because he's basing this off of a painting by Titian. But the problem is he's showing this woman here basically as a prostitute. So if he uses a prostitute as a model, that's not really seen as faux pas. That would be, okay. It's just a prostitute in that society would be considered a really low social woman of very low social standing. And so it would be putting someone of a low social class in the position of someone who should be in this kind of honorable type of position. And so that was something that was seen as very controversial. And so the things that are making her appear as a prostitute here is basically her dress. Obviously, she doesn't have much dress on, but the flower, the little thing around her neck and wrist, and sandals there would basically distinguish her as a lady of the night, as they say. That, along with the flowers being presented to her, kind of assumes her being presented by a male client or suitor of some sort. We have that black cat there on the corner of the bed, as well as the woman in the background. All of those are kind of allusions towards hypersexuality. And so to put someone like that in this, this low social standing on this pedestal here is seen as kind of absurd and really kind of crass, essentially. And so these paintings were so controversial. It's kind of funny to go back and read some of the reactions that they would say that people would faint when they would see, these types of paintings here. The one on the left was actually presented before the one on the right. Every year, every couple of years, they would have the salon, which is where you would put your paintings. You would at least want to exhibit them in the salon, because that's where you'd really be able to kind of cement your reputation if you were to have success at the salon. And so he submits the one on the left to the salon. It doesn't get in, so he basically exhibits it in something called the Salon de Refusés. Basically the paintings that didn't make it into the salon. And then a couple years later, in the next salon, he presents the painting on the right, and it actually is in the salon. And so, like I said, there's people, or accounts of people as they pass by, they like faint because they can't believe, this type of artwork this artist is presenting. They can't believe how against social taboos it is. And we lose a lot of that reference because in our today's society we don't have quite the class system maybe that they would have had. But nonetheless, the controversy was very real. There's accounts of art critics. The art critic just calls Manet. He just calls him a pervert. He said, "This guy's a pervert. This guy's a sociopath." Was a quote that he had for what they thought of his work. There's accounts of them basically making sure these paintings are out of the reach of the people that pass them by, and that was that was done to make sure that they wouldn't rip them into shreds. I mean, people are really up in arms about these paintings. And so one thing that we're going to see is a lot of artists are going to look at Manet here, and they're going to see how he's kind of bucking against the system to a certain extent. How he would have kind of known the rules here, and then him kind of doing these other things. For instance, another thing that I didn't mention is that nudes weren't supposed to gaze right back into the viewer. That nudes were not supposed to look directly back into the viewer's gaze. And so that's what's happening here. That's also seen as something controversial. Okay, so little things like that he seems to be intentionally doing here are things that these artists are going to look at and kind of use as inspiration for their art. Okay, so Manet there is a very, very seminal figure as far as modern art is concerned, which is where we're headed. And these other artists are very important steps here along that path as well. Okay, so this next artist is Claude Monet with an O. And this is an example of one of his paintings, the Gare Saint-Lazare. Okay, so this versus something like this is very different. The brush strokes completely different. This is very, very sketchy, whereas something like this is very, very finished. Okay, subject matter. We don't have a classical type of subject matter. We basically just have a rainy, hazy day in a Paris train station. Okay, and so subject matter is completely different. Some type of contemporary life here. The style, as far as the sketchiness of the art, completely different as well. A lot of times the palette will be different as well. The palette's going to be a lot lighter too. And this is where we get the name for this next era here in art. The name of this painting is called Impression Sunrise, and so that's where we get the name Impressionism from. And you can see just how sketchy a lot of these paintings are. That what these Impressionists are really concerned about is getting kind of the overall atmosphere down, as opposed to kind of the strict recreation of objects. Much more concerned about how kind of light plays, how it presents itself, and how it can be recorded in terms of, like I mentioned, in terms of that atmosphere. And so with Monet, it's kind of interesting sometimes if you see his work. For instance, I went and saw his show in Houston not that long ago, and he'll have like maybe 4 different paintings of the exact same object, but they're different paintings because they're completely different colors a lot of times, because he paints them at different parts of the day when the atmosphere would give different colors. So you can see this one, as the sun's just risen here, we have more of an orange glow to the sky. We have kind of this blue haze as well, and so it kind of creates this kind of hazy type of look to it. But nonetheless, we have a lot of that warm, cool contrast, which is something Monet is very well known for as well. And so this type of sketchiness is due to what a lot of these artists are doing, and that's something called plein air painting, which is P-L-E-I-N-A-I-R-E, plein air. And that's basically painting on site. Okay, so what artists would have traditionally done in a lot of cases is they would go to a site and they would, give themselves some kind of sketch, something done maybe in watercolor or maybe just a few oils put together, and then they would take that painting sketch and bring it back to their studio and then work on their, their long painting in the studio. Now, some of these artists that we see here with the Impressionists, a lot of times they're just doing something that is plein air. So they're just painting on site, and so that's going to be part of the reason for the sketchiness, is because they are basically sketches. And that's kind of the purpose in a lot of cases, is to render the atmospheric conditions going on at the time. So it wouldn't make any sense to bring it back to the studio, because those atmospheric conditions wouldn't be in front of you at that point. Excuse me. Another one of our Impressionists is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. So Renoir here, the title would be Dance at Le Moulin de la Galette. And here we see another scene of daily Parisian life. Something we see in the shadows here, and we see a lot here and here, is the usage of the color blue, which is something we see a lot, along with the generally lighter palette of the era. And that, like I said, is traced back to this plein air type of style, where you have more light because you're using, basically the light of the sun. And part of that plein air feeling is part of the sketchiness that we see in this aspect here. If you're going to paint this, for instance, you're not going to get perfect representations of the people, because they're not going to pose for 3 hours for you to get the exact picture right. And so that's going to be a reason here for some of the sketchy type of quality that we see, because it would have had to have been rendered pretty quick to get the kind of the effects that he's looking for. Now, another thing this shows is something else that is pretty well known here, as far as the type of thing that we see with Impressionism, and that is cropping. We see a lot of close cropping here with Impressionists. And that's believed to be influenced by Japanese prints. A lot of these artists, in addition to being painters, are also printmakers, and the availability of Japanese prints is an influence, because of Japanese prints, cropping is something that we see a lot. So that seems to be what a lot of these artists with these Impressionists here are doing, cropping a lot of things to make the image a little bit more visually appealing. An example of that would be this artist, Edgar Degas, and this is called the ballet class. He's known for doing kind of ballerinas and dancers, and that's kind of one of his motifs that he goes with. And the last impressionist here is Mary Cassatt. The painting on the left is the boating party, and the one on the right is Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. And so there's a lot of things that that really kind of show what the style of impressionists, what they tend to do. Okay, we have that plein air feeling, especially on the left there, that kind of sketchy type of quality to it. We have the prevalence of the blue that's used. Part of the reason we see that prevalence of the blue is that, like I said, a lot of times they are outside doing the plein air thing. But also, paint is now available in little tubes, the little tubes we would be familiar with today. And this is really kind of one of the first times that's actually the case. And so it's actually a lot easier now at this point with the invention of these little tubes to go ahead and bring them outside and use them for plein air painting. And so blue traditionally is a color that's kind of associated with royalty along with purple, because purple and blues, those were dyes and paints that were really hard to come by. And so they were expensive. Well, now they're not quite as expensive. They're a little bit easier, like I said, to become portable, basically. And so artists are using them a lot more now. And so we see, again, that prevalence of blue. We see the lighter palette with the color. We see the close cropping, and we see that sketchy quality. Okay, so all of those things are things that are pretty emblematic of this Impressionist era. The next era that we have are what we call Post-Impressionists. And so with Post-Impressionists, it's not really one kind of style or a lot of styles that have the same type of themes like we see with Impressionism. They're basically just artists that are seeing what the Impressionists are doing, and they're being influenced by them, by what they're doing, and kind of, a lot of cases, going like a step further. Okay? So the first one that we will see here is named Georges Seurat. And this is a pretty famous painting called A Sunday on La Grande Jatte. And this is actually a pretty big painting in real life here. And his style is that he basically has dots of mostly primary colors, and the eye will visually blend to make the other colors that you see in the painting. Okay, and so it's coming from the influence of someone like Monet. And so if you see Monet here, a lot of this is so sketchy. It's not the traditional form of painting where you would mix a color, or maybe even mix two complementaries and get a gray on your palette and then put it on the canvas. Here, a lot of times he's just putting it on the canvas and it's kind of blending up there, where we will visually blend it ourselves because they're opposite colors next to each other. And so in a lot of cases, that's the influence for Seurat here. So in places that we would actually perceive a green, if we would look really close, we'd actually see it's a series of yellow dots mostly with a series of blue dots as well. So those two main colors are going to visually blend to become a green. And the areas we would see in an orange, if we would zoom up really, really close, we would see that it's basically yellow dots and then a lot of red dots as well. And most of those two colors are going to visually come together and produce that orange. And you can see on the border, if you look close there, that you can see the dots a little bit easier there, by the way he's kind of giving us a border there of those dots. But it's kind of this deconstruction, I guess, in a way, of the way that we are perceiving color and bringing it down to its kind of most essential elements here and allowing our eye to visually blend them. Okay, our next artist is Paul Cézanne, and this is called Mount Sainte-Victoire. And in the same way that Seurat is kind of bringing color down to its essential elements here, Seurat is doing the same type of thing with more of the, I guess, geometric aspects of this one. we have a very kind of planar analysis of the shapes here of the mountain and the countryside. An example of that is the buildings, like in the bottom portion of the painting, especially building there in the bottom center. You can see it's just being identified using a side done in yellow, a side done in blue, and then the top done in red. Very, very basic, geometric description of that house there, and everything around it is kind of having the same type of planar description in terms of these basic geometric shapes that we see here. Okay, maybe our most famous of these post-impressionists is this artist, Vincent van Gogh, and this one is called Landscape with Plowed Fields. And with Van Gogh, you can really see a change in his work if you look at his early work and then you look at him being introduced to a lot of what these impressionists and post-impressionists are doing, and the color scheme for his art really, really changes. In kind of his older style, he uses kind of a lot of somber type of almost Baroque type of color palette, and then he gets introduced to this kind of this new crop of artists here, and then his color is really, really amplified. He uses this really bright, intense colors, really the brightest, most intense colors he can find, and his brush strokes are very vibrant as well. And so what Van Gogh is really known for is being all about expression with his style in terms of brush strokes, with his color choices, his palette. Very, very expressive type of artist. He will tend to use primary colors a lot in his work too. Here's probably his most famous painting here, the Starry Night. And you can see the influence here that we have with those directional forces of that really thick type of linear brush stroke that he's working with, and it really gives us a flow to the composition. It really sends us throughout the composition. And we have this contrast that we see, the dark and the light contrast, as well as the warm and the cool contrast of the yellow and the blue. And so we see also a lot of intensity with all of that as well. And so that's what Van Gogh is really all about. He's all about trying to get some type of expression. Obviously here with these landscapes, he's working from nature, but he's kind of amplifying things a bit. The color in a lot of situations isn't exactly the type of color that he would have perceived. It's color that maybe he's amplifying, turning up the volume on a little bit just to give us a sense of expression. For instance, the sky's not going to look like this if you go outside, even on a windswept night, but it gives you the feeling of that with the way that he's describing the sky. So that type of expressive content is really what he's all about. Okay, another example of how artists will use color here for expressive purposes is this next artist, Paul Gauguin. The painting on the left is Vision After the Sermon, and on the right it's called The Day of the God. And so the colors that we see here wouldn't be what he would have perceived here. They're just amplified for expressive content, similar in some ways a little bit more so than Mr. Van Gogh here. Okay, this artist is Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and this is called At the Moulin Rouge. And so one aspect that he's really going a step further with here is the cropping that we see with the Impressionists. Here he's just going one step further and just outright cropping there that figure in the foreground. Half of her face is being cropped out there, which is not something we would really see in art until this time here. And so that's an example of again how they're kind of taking things they see from the Impressionists here, going a step further. And with Toulouse-Lautrec here, he is pretty well known for doing scenes of nightlife in Paris, whereas the Impressionists would have been doing scenes of daily Parisian life. And our last artist here is Edvard Munch, and this is one of the most famous paintings in history, The Scream. And you can see in this example, his style is actually pretty similar to Van Gogh's. You can see here the sky, the colors he's using, the expressiveness of his mark. He's using these kind of organic, flowing forms for nature, for the landscape, and the bridge is more of a geometric form there. So we have those, those two basic contrasts. We see the contrast of the color. That yellow versus that orange versus that blue. It gives us a lot of contrast in terms of intensity. And you can see, like Van Gogh, he's also being more expressive as opposed to just kind of recreating nature, especially that figure there in the foreground. You can see the way he's kind of elongating the face there, as well as the body. It gives you this kind of eerie type of feeling from this, that it definitely looks like something is amiss, something's not quite right, which is kind of the point here with the Scream, that it shows some type of intensity here that we wouldn't get if we would just see straight naturalism. Okay, and so this is something that is going to be important here for the history of art, that we're going to undergo a sea change of sorts. With the paradigm of art, we're going to shift basically from a certain type of art that is all about naturalism into another type of art that we'll see soon here, and that's going to be when art is all about expression, basically. Okay, and so if we look kind of that older tradition of art, dating back from the French Academy to Baroque art down to the Renaissance, that verisimilitude is a big deal, which is lifelikeness. That you can largely base the value of art on how lifelike and how naturalistic it is. With this new kind of paradigm or era of art that we'll get to, basically the modern era, the main focus of art isn't so much naturalism, it's expression. And that's really going to be the major thing here as we get into our next era, which will be modern art, is that that idea of expression is going to be paramount. All right, so we'll look at that next time.